The quiet confession. The studio lights were warm and soft, wrapping the room in a golden glow. Cameras pointed toward Keanu Reeves as the podcast host leaned forward with a friendly smile. The topic had been light until now, about movies, motorcycles, and life. But then the host's tone changed slightly. He smiled and said, "Keanu, fans have always wondered about you and Sandra. What really happened back then?" For a second, Keanu froze. His calm face shifted just a little, his eyes lowering as if searching for a memory. The audience behind the glass laughed gently, waiting for his reply. But Keanu stayed quiet. The silence in that moment felt heavy, almost emotional. He finally said softly, "She was special. Very special." The host leaned closer. "So there was something real between you two." Keanu smiled, but it was not a simple smile. It carried years of unspoken truth. He replied, "Sometimes the best people enter your life when you are not ready for them." His voice was calm, yet deep with feeling. Sandra's name hung in the air like a gentle echo. Even the cameraman lowered his lens for a second. The host noticed Keanu's eyes turning distant. "You mean you regret something?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "Not regret, maybe just a wish that time had been kinder." His words hit everyone in the room. No one expected such honesty. Outside the glass wall, the city lights flickered through the evening rain. Adding a poetic sadness to his words, he continued, "When we worked together, we were young, full of dreams, and both hiding behind our smiles. I think we understood each other without saying much." The host whispered, "Did she know how you felt?" Keanu looked down, then back up. Maybe she did. Maybe she felt it too. But sometimes life decides differently. His tone softened again. "There were days I wanted to tell her everything. But we were filming, and I did not want to change the energy. She was always kind, always thoughtful. She once brought me homemade cookies because she thought I looked tired." The audience chuckled, but Keanu's expression stayed serious. "It sounds small, but that moment stayed with me for years." The host smiled gently. "So you kept it inside?" Keanu nodded. "Some feelings grow quieter with time, but they never disappear. They become part of who you are." The studio fell silent again. The host, sensing the emotion, decided not to push further. But deep inside, he knew he had uncovered something real. After the show ended, Keanu walked alone through the hallway. He looked at an old photo on his phone, him and Sandra laughing on set years ago. Her hand on his shoulder, his eyes full of warmth. He smiled faintly and whispered, "I hope she's happy." But before he could leave, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a number he had not seen in years. It read, "I heard your podcast. You still remember?" His heart stopped for a second. The name below the message made his breath tremble. It was from Sandra. The unexpected message, Keanu stared at the glowing screen, unable to blink. The words felt unreal, almost like a dream he was afraid to disturb. "I heard your podcast. You still remember?" His heart beat faster, not because of fame or pressure, but because of an emotion he thought time had buried long ago. He sat on the couch, the studio lights now off, leaving only the soft glow of his phone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. 1,000 thoughts flooded his mind. What should he say? Should he even reply? After so many years, what could he possibly tell her? Finally, he typed, "Of course I remember. Some people are impossible to forget." He hesitated, then pressed send. Seconds felt like hours. He placed the phone beside him, but his eyes never left the screen. After a few minutes, it buzzed again. "You still sound like the same kind person I met all those years ago." Keanu smiled, a quiet, sad smile. "And you still sound like the same voice that made bad days feel lighter," he typed back. They began talking that night, softly, slowly, carefully. Not like celebrities, but like two people finding lost pages of a book they once wrote together. Sandra told him she watched the whole podcast twice. She said, "You spoke like someone who still carries something unfinished." Keanu replied, "Maybe I do." Their messages grew longer. Soon they moved from words to memories. They spoke about the days on set, the laughter between takes, the quiet lunches away from the cameras. Sandra admitted something that made his heart skip. "There were times I wanted to tell you how I felt too, but I was scared it would change everything." Keanu paused before replying. "It would not have changed everything." Maybe it would have saved something. She sent a small heart emoji, simple, but powerful. Over the next few days, their conversations turned more emotional. Sandra shared how lonely fame sometimes felt, how she missed having someone who understood her silence. Keanu listened, always gentle, always patient. He said, "Silence never scared me. Sometimes silence is the most honest thing." One evening, she sent him a voice message. Her voice cracked slightly as she said, "You once told me that life decides differently. Maybe it is time we decide for ourselves." Those words stayed in his heart. That night, Keanu looked out of his apartment window at the Los Angeles skyline. His reflection merged with the city lights. He whispered, "Maybe it's time." He picked up his phone again and wrote, "Sandra, are you free tomorrow? Maybe we should talk in person." The message showed delivered, then seen. Her reply came minutes later. "I would like that." He smiled softly, his eyes wet, his heart racing. Tomorrow could change everything. But far away, Sandra looked at her phone with a worried expression. She whispered to herself, "Keanu, there is something I have to tell you before we meet." The secret she carried the next morning arrived quietly. Sunlight poured through Keanu's apartment windows, touching his face as he sat by the table, lost in thought. He had not slept much, replaying old memories again and again. The laughter on set, the quiet drives back home, the look in Sandra's eyes when she thought no one was watching. He checked his phone every few minutes. The meeting was set for later that evening at a small cafe near the coast. It was the same place they once visited after a film shoot years ago. He smiled faintly, remembering how she had teased him for drinking black coffee without sugar. As the day moved on, Keanu tried to calm himself with a motorcycle ride along the ocean road. The wind brushed against his face, but his heart was restless. This was not just a reunion. It felt like unfinished destiny. Evening came. The cafe was peaceful, with soft music and warm light. Keanu arrived first, sitting near the window that overlooked the sea. He kept glancing toward the door. When Sandra finally entered, time seemed to pause. She looked graceful yet thoughtful, her eyes holding both warmth and worry. "Hey," Keanu said gently as he stood up. She smiled. "Hey," she whispered back. Their voices carried the weight of years unspoken. They sat down, and for a while neither spoke. Sandra finally broke the silence. "You look the same," she said softly. Keanu chuckled. "That's what happens when you live quietly?" She nodded, her smile fading into something more serious. "I listened to your podcast 3 times, she confessed. Every word felt like it was meant for me." Keanu lowered his eyes. "Maybe it was," she sighed deeply. "I thought I was ready to talk to you again. But there's something I must tell you first." Keanu leaned forward. "You can tell me anything." Her eyes glistened as she said, "I've been hiding something for a long time." His chest tightened, but he remained calm. "What is it, Sandra?" She took a deep breath. "A few years after we lost touch, I met someone." He was kind, understanding. "We grew close." Keanu stayed silent, listening carefully. She continued, "He passed away 2 years ago. Cancer. I never talked about it publicly. Only a few people know." Keanu's expression softened with deep compassion. "I'm so sorry, Sandra." She nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "It broke me for a long time. I stopped believing in love, in connection, in anything real. That's why when I heard your voice again, it brought something back, something I thought was gone." Keanu looked at her gently. "You don't owe me an apology." "I just wish I could have been there for you." She smiled weakly. "You always had a way of making people feel safe." For a while, they sat in silence, the sound of waves filling the air. Sandra finally said, "But there's more." Keanu looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" Her hands trembled slightly as she reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. It was a picture of them during their first film together, both laughing, carefree, young. But in the corner of the photo, there was a small folded note. She handed it to him. "I never told you this, but on our last day of shooting, I wrote something for you. I never gave it because I was scared." Keanu unfolded the note slowly. Inside, written in her handwriting, were the words, "If time ever brings us back together, maybe we'll know what it meant." He looked up, his voice breaking slightly. "You kept this all these years?" She nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Because a part of me always knew we'd meet again." Before Keanu could reply, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting instantly. She whispered, "I'm sorry, I have to take this." She stepped outside the cafe, answering in a low voice. Keanu watched her through the glass, noticing the worry on her face. Something about that call didn't feel right. When she returned, she looked pale. "Keanu," she said softly, "I need to tell you one more thing. And this one might change everything." The truth revealed, Sandra sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breath. Keanu noticed the sudden change in her expression. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by quiet fear. The sound of waves outside the cafe grew louder, almost echoing the tension between them. "Sandra," Keanu said softly, "what happened?" She looked at him, her voice low. "That call was from my doctor." Keanu's heart sank, but he stayed calm, listening. "Is everything all right?" he asked. She hesitated. "I found out a few months ago that I have a condition. It's not life-threatening yet, but it's serious." "The treatment has been difficult." Keanu leaned forward, concern clear in his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" She smiled weakly. "Because I didn't want this to be about pity. I wanted you to see me as the same person you once knew. Strong, full of laughter." Keanu shook his head gently. "You don't need to hide your pain to be strong." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was scared, Keanu. Scared that if we reconnected, it would be because of sympathy, not love. But hearing your voice again, it reminded me of something I had lost. Peace." The cafe felt still, like time had paused for them. Keanu reached across the table and held her hand. "You've given strength to so many people your whole life. Let someone give some back to you." Her lips quivered as she whispered, "You always say the right thing." For a moment, silence surrounded them again. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, the kind that words couldn't describe. "So," Keanu said quietly, "what now?" She looked out the window, watching the reflection of the sea lights. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I know one thing. I don't want to disappear from your life again." Keanu smiled, his voice calm yet full of emotion. "Then you won't." They decided to take a walk along the beach after leaving the cafe. The air was cool, and the sound of the waves blended with the distant hum of the city. Sandra walked slowly, her hand brushing against his. "Remember the day we filmed that bus scene?" she said, smiling faintly. "You were terrified of heights." Keanu laughed. "I still am." She laughed too, and for a moment, the sadness disappeared. Then her tone softened again. "Keanu, do you ever think about how life gives second chances?" He looked at her thoughtfully. "I think life always gives second chances, but we're too afraid to take them." She stopped walking and turned toward him. "So if this is ours, would you take it?" Keanu didn't answer with words. He simply nodded and gently took her hand, holding it with quiet certainty. As they stood under the fading sky, a wave crashed nearby, scattering droplets that glimmered under the light. Sandra smiled softly. "You know, I always wondered what peace felt like. I think I just found it." But as they walked back, Sandra's phone buzzed again. She looked at the screen, her face turning pale. "What is it?" Keanu asked, worried. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she showed him the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. The text read, "We need to talk about the treatment. It's spreading faster than expected." Keanu felt his heart stop for a moment. Sandra closed her eyes, whispering, "I didn't want you to find out like this." He looked at her, his eyes firm but gentle. "Then let's face it together." She looked up, tears glistening under the streetlight. "You mean that?" "More than anything," he said quietly. They stood there under the soft golden light, their shadows merging on the sand. Two souls reunited not by fate but by courage. But deep inside, Keanu knew this was just the beginning of a much harder journey, one that would test the strength of love itself. Love through the storm days turned into weeks after that night on the beach. Keanu and Sandra began spending more time together, quietly, away from cameras and headlines. They would meet early in the morning at her garden, drink coffee, and talk about everything that once went unsaid. Sometimes they laughed about the old days, and sometimes they just sat in silence, letting the wind speak for them. Sandra started her treatment again, this time with Keanu by her side. He went with her to every appointment, waiting patiently in hospital corridors while she smiled bravely through the pain. He would bring her flowers every time, never the same kind twice. "Each flower reminds me of a different version of you," he would say. She would smile, her voice soft. "And how many versions are there?" He would answer, "As many as there are sunsets I've seen since you left." Those words always made her eyes fill with tears, but they also gave her strength. Keanu's calm presence turned her fear into quiet hope. When she lost her appetite, he cooked her soup himself. When she felt weak, he read her favorite poems until she fell asleep. One afternoon, as rain fell outside, Sandra looked at him from her couch and whispered, "Do you ever wonder why life brought us back together now, after all this time?" Keanu looked at her gently. "Maybe because we were never meant to end as strangers." She smiled faintly. "You still speak like a poet?" He shrugged lightly. "Only when I'm looking at you." Their bond deepened with each passing day. It was no longer about regret or lost chances. It had become something pure. Two souls rediscovering love, not in perfection, but in presence. But as her illness progressed, the nights grew heavier. Sandra often woke up restless, staring out the window at the city lights. One night, Keanu found her standing there, her hands shaking. "You can't sleep again?" he asked softly. She nodded. "I keep thinking about what will happen when I'm gone." He walked over, holding her shoulders gently. "Don't talk like that." She turned to face him, tears forming. "Keanu, I don't want you to break again. You've lost too much already." He shook his head. "Then don't go anywhere. Fight with me every day until the world gives up first." His voice was steady, but his eyes glimmered with pain. She placed her palm on his chest. "You've always carried more love than anyone I know. Maybe that's why life keeps testing you." He smiled softly. "Love isn't something to hide from, Sandra. It's the only thing that makes the pain worth it." Her eyes trembled and she whispered, "I love you, Keanu." The words hung in the air, fragile yet eternal. Keanu didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped closer and wrapped his arms around her, holding her as if time itself had paused. "I love you too," he said quietly. For the first time in years, she felt safe again, not because her pain was gone, but because she didn't have to face it alone. Days later, during one of her therapy sessions, the doctor called Keanu aside. "She's responding, but her body is weaker than before. She'll need more care." Keanu nodded firmly. "Whatever it takes." That night, as he sat beside her, she opened her eyes and said, "You could walk away, you know." "You don't have to do this." He looked at her, his voice calm. "I walked away once. I won't make that mistake again." Her eyes softened. "Then promise me one thing," she whispered. "Anything," he said. "When this is over, no matter what happens, keep living." "Don't fade with me," he smiled gently. "The best way to honor you is to live with your light." As the moonlight touched her face, she closed her eyes peacefully. Keanu held her hand through the night, whispering softly, "We'll make it, Sandra, one day at a time." But outside, the rain began to fall harder, tapping against the window like a warning. The storm was far from over. The promise that stayed, the storm that night never really stopped. The clouds lingered for days, heavy and unkind. Yet inside Sandra's house, there was still warmth. The quiet sound of Keanu's voice reading aloud from her favorite book. The soft flicker of candles, the smell of jasmine tea she loved. Weeks passed, and her health grew fragile. She smiled less often, but every time she did, it carried more meaning. Keanu stayed close through every moment, never once missing a morning visit. His presence became her medicine, his calm energy stronger than any treatment. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, she asked him to open the window. "I want to feel the wind again," she said softly. Keanu opened it, letting the cool air brush against her face. She smiled faintly. "It feels like freedom." He pulled a chair beside her bed. Do you remember what you told me years ago on set? He asked. She tilted her head slightly. Which one? I said a lot of things. He smiled. You said, life gives us scenes we can't rehearse, only feel. I never forgot that. She looked at him with tired eyes that still held light. You always listened too closely. He nodded. Because your words always meant something. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but steady. You kept your promise, didn't you? She whispered. He looked at her gently. Which one? The one where you said you'd never let me face it alone. His eyes filled with tears. I meant every word. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of the wind filled the silence. Sandra finally said, You know, I'm not afraid anymore. Why? He asked softly. She smiled. Because I know my story will live inside someone kind. Her voice broke slightly. Keanu held her hand tighter. It already does, he whispered. As the sun rose higher, she closed her eyes, breathing slowly. He stayed beside her, holding her hand until she fell asleep. When he realized she wouldn't wake again, he didn't cry immediately. He just sat there quietly, his thumb tracing her palm, as if trying to memorize the shape of her presence. Days later, during a quiet ceremony by the ocean, Keanu stood alone, holding the old photograph she had once given him, the one with their laughter frozen in time. In the corner of that photo, he noticed something he had never seen before, a faint line, almost invisible, written in her handwriting. It read, Thank you for being my peace. His tears finally fell, not from sorrow, but from gratitude. He whispered into the wind, You still are my peace. As the waves touched the shore, he placed the photo inside a small glass bottle and let it drift into the water. He watched it float away, carried by the tide toward the horizon. Months passed, and Keanu returned to work, not to escape, but to honor her wish to keep living. In every interview, every quiet moment, her memory stayed like sunlight on his shoulder. He never spoke publicly about her last days, but in one interview months later, when asked about love, he smiled faintly and said, Real love doesn't end. It just changes the way it stays. The host went silent, moved by his calm truth. And somewhere, perhaps beyond the waves, that small glass bottle kept floating, carrying her laughter, his promise and a love that had outlived time itself.